Welcome to the first PowerPoint for the first chapter of the JANT textbook, Introduction to Intercultural Communication for HUMA 221, Intercultural Communication. So chapter 1 is about defining culture and communication. Now the learning objectives for this chapter and what you'll learn from this PowerPoint, you will be able to do the following. 1, you'll be able to understand the regulators of human behavior and identity. 2, you'll be able to understand the meanings and the connotations of the terms culture, subcultures, co-cultures, subgroups, and microcultures. Thirdly, you'll be able to understand how communication is defined by different cultures, and also to understand how people of diverse cultures communicate differently. And finally, we will understand the link between culture and media. So the first thing we'll look at is our shared ancestry from one group in Africa and the diversity of ways to understand the worlds of languages. Now, evidence from genetic research and linguistic observation suggests that all humans alive today share a certain ancestry from one group in Africa. Now, this is just a theory. Yet it's very interesting. Among the 7 billion of us, there are a diversity of languages, a diversity of beliefs, and a diversity of ways of understanding the world and defining our identities. So we have to stop and ask ourselves, how did these diverse cultures develop? Why is it that in China, they speak Chinese and they have certain habits and rituals and religions? When in Africa, we have another set of languages or religions or ways of doing things. Or in South America, yet another way. How did we get to this point? Now, one theory says that it's because of climate change or other pressures, and that led to migrations out of Africa. Another way of looking at it is from a socio-historical way. And we're going to look at a neuroscientist called Antonio Damasio, who in 2010 looked at the development of diverse social networks. He said that these social network regulators of human life over the whole history of humanity have been the basis for beliefs and identities. We'll also look at a theorist called Sir David Carradine, 2013. Now, I hope you're remembering these names, Antonio Damasio and Sir David Carradine, 2013. And we'll look closely at these 6 forms of regulators for social networks of human life. Now, these are, just have a look, these are the 6 main forms of regulators are, right. So David Carradine, 2013, said that the 6 main form regulators of social networks of human life are religion, nation, class, gender, race, and civilization. And we'll look at these one by one in more detail. Now, the first one is religion and identity. Now, religion is the oldest source of human identity, but it's also the oldest source of conflict. Now, at some times we've had religions and religious groups who coexist without conflict. However, in the past, many wars have been fought over religion. and usually caused or justified by differences in religious beliefs, exclusive of other issues. And these have resulted in tens of millions of deaths over the course of human history. Now, there are many of these, but to name a few, we could look at the Crusades in the 11th to 13th centuries. This was the Christians against the Muslims. We could go back in European civilization to the 16th century to the wars of succession between Roman Catholics and Protestants. More recently, in the 1990s, we could look at the former Yugoslavia, and there were terrible wars fought among certain religious and cultural groups there. They were the Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Muslim. So that's that area now known as Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro. And we can also look closer to home at the divide between the Sunni and the Shiite Muslims in Iraq. Now, another regulator, according to Canadine, is national identity. And this was something that was very popular in the 18th century. So now we're talking 2 centuries ago. 18th century national identity has superseded religious identity as a primary identity in many parts of the world. So what I mean by national identity is by, what are you? Are you Emirati? Are you German? Are you Swiss? Are you British? Are you Australian? Now, we would say, yes, national identity is important, but your identity is more than just your national identity. Your national identity is made up of the other regulator of religion and of class and of certain ways of being that we will look at in more detail. So national identity is not descriptive when it's just about political boundaries. You are more than just your political boundary. And of course, national identity has often been a source of conflict. The next regulator we'll look at is class and identity. And I want you to know 2 names here. One is Marx, Karl Marx, and one is Max Engels. And we're going back again to centuries 1850. Now, they claimed that identities were not created by religion or by countries, but in the relationship to the means of production. The means of production means who owns the resources in a society. Now, while classes may exist in any society, how clearly defined they are and how much they are a source of identity varies. So Max Weber, another important name, he said that class is determined by skill and education. Now, in some societies, you're born into a particular class and you can never move out of it. So, for example, have a look at India and the caste system that used to be in place and to a certain extent still exists. Max Weber said, no, it should be, I guess, what we call a meritocracy, where class is determined by skill and education. Whatever the way you define it, when we look at social class, we can look at divisions that divide people, and they assign values to differences, and it also, like religion, can be a source of identity that can lead to conflict. Now, another one of Canadine's regulators is gender and identity. Now, gender identity, some people say, could be defined more than one's culture than by one's biology. And how a culture deals with gender reveals much about that culture's values. Now, according to feminists, gender identity is more significant than religion, nation, or class. And the 5th regulator, according to Canadine, is race, skin color, and identity. Now, race has been defined from 2 perspectives, biological and socio-historical. So let's have a look firstly at the biological perspective. When you look at race as biology, it says that race is a biological base, and it's based on visible physical characteristics such as skin color or other facial and bodily features. So, for example, in 1735, the Swedish scientist Carolus Linnaeus classified humans as Africanus, Americanus, Asiaticus, and Europaeus. Now, this is quite old-fashioned. As we know now from a lot of intermarrying, a lot of moving around, we are probably defined more by other regulators than by race, because we are a mix. And the trouble with the biologically based definition of race, it is something fixed. Now, the socio-historical way, before we move on, I'd like to also talk about how this biological classification of race leads to a kind of institutional racism. And a lot of that came from the 19th century. There was like a pseudoscience, a fake news, a fake science, racial science. And they ordered races from the primitive to the most advanced. Well, we know that not to be a very valid way of looking at things. In the 20th century, with the development of genome studies and genetic studies, they found, and it's very important to know this, that there is no single race-defining gene. Now let's have a look at the socio-historical. I also want you to consider that racial categories were created by power-holding Europeans. Now this links us to imperialism, to colonialism, and to a fake hierarchy of superiority based on race. And at this time, back in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, and lingering now on to this day in certain places, as we see in America today, they linked superior traits with Europeans and inferior traits with Blacks and Indians. And we would like to move beyond that kind of classification. Now, I mentioned the socio-historical way of looking at race. The socio-historical concept goes beyond just facial features and color and looks at how racial categories have varied over time and between cultures. And in the socio-historical version, it's not fixed. They are unstable, they are fluid, and they are socially determined through constant debate. Now, the sixth regulator, according to Kennedy, is civilization and identity. Back in the 19th century, unfortunately, the term culture was used as a synonym for Western civilization. Now, we know also this is not true, because even before these European classifications, when we had the Ottoman Empire, when we had the Moors, when we had earlier Islamic societies, they had discovered arithmetic, they had discovered irrigation, they had a very highly developed civilization. So we can look at these as historical information, but we know these not to be true. So for example, Taylor had developmental stages of civilization. He said they were developed into savagery, barbarism, and civilization. And closer in time, we have a guy called Huntington. Now, Huntington wrote a book called The Clash of Civilizations. And this book has resulted in a lot of people looking at civilization as a binary, particularly East versus West, which is a kind of dangerous way to go for terms of intercultural communication and intercultural harmony. He was back in 1996, and he posited that civilizations were the most important form of human identity. And just to go into more detail on Huntington, Huntington divided so-called civilizations into Western, Latin American, Sub-Saharan African, Eastern Orthodox, Islamic, Confucian, Hindu, and Japanese. Now, many people would say this is reductive, oversimplifying breaking things down into units so that they can be chopped up into pieces of a pie, but perhaps not very useful for intercultural communication and understanding because it divides people rather than unites them. However, it's important to understand this historically so that we can see how we got to this point in time where we have all of this division in society, all of this division globally, particularly during this time of pandemic. So we have looked so far at ways of classifying and looking at identity. And what is important to remember is Canadine's 6 regulators of society. Very, very important. And just to recap, he said that there were 6 main forms of regulators. They were religion, nation, class, gender, race, and civilization. And later on, when you do the first task for assessment, your cultural artifact task, when I ask you to bring in an artifact that represents your identity, I want you not just to show the object, but to relate it to this theory, to relate it to these 6 regulators of identity. I will also like you to relate it to other regulators of identity, which are symbols, rituals, values, and heroes. So let's look at those in more detail. Symbols refer to verbal and non-verbal language. So things we might not give a name to, but represent certain things. Rituals refer to socially essential collective activities. So rituals would be related to religion. Fasting during Ramadan would be a ritual. Celebrating during Eid would be a ritual because a collective part of society is all sharing in this shared ritual. In other parts of the world, there are New Year festivals. In China, Chinese New Year. There are New Year festivals in the West. In America, we have Halloween. Also in Scotland, we have Halloween. There's Guy Fawkes Day in Britain. So every culture has its own rituals. So when you bring your artifact, you could be looking at a ritual that it belongs to. Another way of classifying culture is to look at the values a culture has. Now, every culture has feelings that are not open to discussion, no-go areas, things about what is good and bad in your culture, what is moral and immoral, what is halal, what is haram, if we want to use in Arabic, what is beautiful, what is ugly, what is normal, what is abnormal. And these values typically are present in the majority of people in a culture. I'm not saying here that these values are always inherently correct, but they are shared values. That's what's important. They belong to a culture of shared values. Now, the other thing we could look at is identity can be related in culture to heroes. Every culture, every country, every nation state has its heroes. Mathalan, in your culture here in the UAE, Sheikh Zayed would be a hero. May he rest in peace. In some countries, you would have Genghis Khan as a hero. In Australia, you have almost an anti-hero. You have Ned Kelly. Rambo could be considered a hero. In America, the hero of the cowboy represents something strong about that culture. So symbols, rituals, values, and heroes are also elements which define culture. Now, within cultures, it's important to realize that we can have subcultures. So within a group, we can have a smaller subgroup within that culture. So a subculture resembles a culture. It usually encompasses a relatively large number of people. It exists within a dominant culture, and it's often a subdivision in the culture based on geographic region, ethnicity, or economic or social class. So within the UAE, we might have subcultures. Within even Emirati citizens, we could have subcultures of Baluch. We could have subcultures of Aini. We could have subcultures of Bani Yas. So this would be a way we could determine subcultures. For example, in Iraq, you would have Iraqi culture and you maybe have Kurdish culture, a subculture within a dominant culture. And within Australia, you have Australian culture, and then you might have Aboriginal culture within that. So there you have subcultures. Now, also within culture, we have ethnicity. Now, ethnicity is a term referring to a group of people of the same descent and heritage who share a common and distinctive culture passed on through generations. Now, distinguishing characteristics could be the language, could be the accent, could be the physical features, the family names, customs, and religion. Now, I'm sure out there we have some people from the El She'i tribe. Now, that's a certain subculture within a larger culture. You have a particular accent, you have a particular language or type of language or dialect. You could even have particular physical features within that subculture, certain family names, certain customs, and of course you share the same religion. And we could extend this to look at other ethnicities within a culture. Now let's look at co-culture. So far we've had culture, we've had subculture, we've had ethnicity, and now we're going to look at co-culture. Now, the term co-culture is something that I want you to become familiar with. Instead of back to the old Huntington idea or the old Taylor idea of racial superiority based on a taxonomy of which one is better than the other, in this intercultural communication class, I would like to put forward the theory and put forward the academic belief that we have co-cultures. No one culture is inherently superior to another coexisting culture. Mutuality may not be easily established, but we would like to respect and to value other cultures. That doesn't mean we forget our own culture. It doesn't mean we don't value our own culture, but we learn to look at other cultures and we see them as co-cultures, existing in peace with us. So, an example of a co-culture in the United States, for example, are American Indians. It could be the same in Australia, where we have a co-culture of the original First Nation people, the Aboriginal culture. These are nations within nations. Now, a further division, we've had culture, we've had subculture, we've had co-culture. I want to go even further and even more nuanced and to look at subgroups. So just as cultures and subcultures are regulators of human life and identity, so are subgroups. Subgroups are what we call membership groups. Now, they exist within a dominant culture and are dependent upon that culture. Like cultures, subgroups provide members with relatively complete values and patterns of behavior, and in many ways pose similar communication problems as cultures. Now, your membership in these subgroups may be temporary. The reference group is the group that someone wants to belong to, creating kind of wannabe behaviors. So a subgroup could be maybe even a group in your profession, maybe as a mohandis, as an engineer, or a pharmacist, or an actor, or a doctor, or a nurse. This is also a subgroup. Now, further within that, we have something called microculture. Now, every one of you out there will belong to some sort of microculture. You are a group not bound by race, not bound by language, but you are bound by certain behaviors and values. So a microculture could be a culture of gaming. You play Fortnite or you play Nintendo. You have your own behaviors. You have your own values. You maybe even have your own little dialect in culture. A microculture could be TikTok. Many of you, I'm sure, out there are involved in TikTok. And that also is a microculture. You have a certain language. You have certain memes that you are repeating all the time. You have certain songs, certain themes which keep recurring. Other microcultures could be a YouTube culture, or a culture of people who are environmentalists, or it could be a beauty culture, a group of people who belong to a certain following, Hoda beauty, etc. This is all a microculture. Now, moving on to the second part of our PowerPoint, we're going to look at cultural definitions of communication. Now, as we learned, culture is a code that we learn and share, and learning and sharing require communication, or else how else is it going to be passed on to other people, to other generations? Now, let's look at some different cultural definitions of communication. And these we will look at in more depth during the course. Now, definitions of communication from many Asian countries stress harmony. For example, a Confucian perspective on communication would define it as an infinite interpretative process where all parties are searching to develop and maintain a social relationship. Now, I can relate this here to the UAE, to Emirati culture, which is based on a tribal culture, where a group has certain shared values, and that group tries to regulate itself and to create harmony by coexisting and communicating in ways and in codes that you learn and share from being very little and watching how other people do things, so that the tribe, so that the group can live in harmony. So there are some similarities there between what we call an Asian Eastern way of harmony and the collective tribal way of harmony. Now, in a Western perspective, by Western I'm talking mainly, say, European, British, American, communication tends to be a one-way, top-down communication suited for transmission media. Now, for example, in Berlow's model of communication, the source is viewed as more active and more important than the receiver. And encoding, what we call speaking, is viewed as superior to listening, which is decoding. I would like to say that this is a little bit limited, because together the encoder and the decoder should be sharing meaning and making meaning together instead of having it top down. And in this way, we can have a lot of miscommunication. So let's go back and look a little bit more at that Confucian perspective of communication. So Confucius set up an ethical moral system intended ideally to govern all relationships in the family, community, and the state. Confucianism emphasizes virtue, selflessness, duty, patriotism, hard work, and respect for hierarchy, both familial and societal. Confucianism guides social relationships. So we have something called particularism, role of intermediaries, the people in between, reciprocity, people back and forth, an in-group and out-group distinction. And there's an overlap of personal and public relationships. The Chinese have developed many verbal strategies such as compliments, greeting rituals, and so on to maintain good interpersonal relations. And of course, if we relate this to UAE society, you also have certain rituals and verbal strategies for compliments, mashallah, and greeting rituals. So, sabah khair, amle, sabah noor, kifak. And these rituals, and rubbing noses, for example, these rituals, or back in the old days before Corona, these rituals were there to maintain good interpersonal relations. Now, if we look at Korea, Korea has special vocabulary for each sex, for different degrees of social status, and degrees of intimacy, and for formal occasions. Korean junior business associates may address seniors with familiar rather than honorific language. A Confucian view of communication would define it as an infinite, interpretative process in which all parties are searching to develop and maintain a social relationship. And I would say that it's the same for your society, because you are constantly negotiating meaning in your communication to develop a social relationship. Now let's have a look again now at the Western perspective on communication. This is just some quick theory. I won't spend too much time on it. I will just quickly go through one model of communication where we look at the source. That's the person with an idea that he or she wants to communicate. They encode it. They put that idea into a symbol. They give the message. The message identifies the encoded thought. The channel, the means through which it's going, so whether it's speaking, whether it's through some sort of media, example. So that's the channel. Then you've got the noise, anything that distorts the message. Then you have the receiver, the person who's getting it. And the receivers may be intentional or unintentional. So you might be meaning to talk to them, or maybe it's unintentional. Someone just hears. They have to decode it. And that's the opposite of encoding from the person. The receiver assigns meaning to the symbols received. Then we have the receiver response, anything the receiver does after having attended to or decoded the message. Then we have the feedback, the portion of the receiver response where the source has knowledge. And then the context in which it takes place. Now, you don't need to remember all of these. I just wanted to point this out as an alternate theoretical way of looking at communication. The most important part for you to remember in this is that from A, the person giving the message, the encoder, to B, the decoder, the person who receives the message, there are a lot of things in the middle where things can be interpreted differently. And for the purposes of this course, this is how intercultural communication can have problems, because from A to B, things don't go smoothly. Now that's within their own culture. Imagine once it's in another culture, cross-culturally, between languages, between cultures, people are bringing their own values and assumptions. Imagine the misunderstandings that can happen. So now let's look finally at the media of intercultural communication. The use of media can help increase contact and communication between cultures. Of course, we know we have the telephone. In 2011, that's a long time ago now, there were 1.2 billion landlines in use and differences in conversational patterns. These days, people are hardly using landlines outside of their work. We also have the internet. Over 2.5 billion users at the time of this publishing, so it must be many more now, in every part of the world. And issues abound in this because, unfortunately, most of the communication in computer communication is English-oriented. So this also can lead to issues when we're dealing cross-culturally. Now, the take-home message in this is that I want you to consider culture and identity as being more than your nationality. Of course, your nationality is an important part of it, but there's more to it than that. I want you to really reflect and remember Canadine's 6 regulators of identity. And remember, these were religion, nation, class, gender, race, and civilization. I also want you to remember that within culture, we have shared symbols, we have shared rituals, which are socially essential collective activities. We have values, feelings not open for discussion in a society, and heroes. So symbols, rituals, values, and heroes. I also want you to think about culture as being not just your nation state culture, but culture that could encompass a subculture, a co-culture, your ethnicity, and a microculture. So please review this information. Look at the PowerPoint again and again, because this forms the basis, the foundations for analyzing intercultural communication in this course. And I'd also like you to visit the lecture notes for this PowerPoint that can be found on Moodle. And I will see you next time for the second PowerPoint in our series on intercultural communication, HUMA 221. Bye for now.